roll down. Sit on the black benches for me, please, and sit kind of close together so everybody can see.
Sorry.
It's bad to freeze in the cold.
Hey, y'all sit as close together as you can, please, so we can get away from opposite.
I think it's a couple feet. There's your stump set on it.
Okay, let's show this to you. My name is Sergeant Hall. I'm with Cobb's Kentucky Battery, 1st Kentucky Brigade, Confederate States Army of the Mississippi. Colonel Hunter of the 9th Kentucky Regiment asked me to come talk to you folks this morning about this conflict we've been involved in the last few years. Of course, now some folks have been calling it the American Civil War, and some folks have been calling it the war between the states. I reckon it depends on your own point of view, because some of us have been referring to it as the war of Yankee aggression. At any rate, this thing started back in '61, much as a result of an institution referred to as slavery. Don't get the idea that slavery was anything new. You see, it's been around for well nigh 400 years. It was back about the 1440s that some Portuguese sailors first went to the west coast of Africa, and they took some black citizens off that coast, and well, they took them to Lisbon, Portugal, and displayed them in front of the king there. It's kind of like strange beings from a foreign world. But what really got this institution of slavery rolling, though, was a discovery by a fellow they called Columbus. You see, he discovered what they referred to as the New World. And once he'd done so, a lot of folks from the old world would be wanting to move to it. About the time they booked passage on a ship, bought seeds for crops and tools to plant the crops and things, well, they just didn't have a whole lot of money left to see to pay for labor. Of course, the answer to that problem was free labor, and of course that meant slave labor. And I ain't here to argue the rights and wrongs of slavery. I've been leaving that up to the politicians. Of course, they've been arguing about that for quite some time when they come up with all these what they call political compromises on the issue. Had the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and of course the Kansas and Nebraska Acts in the 40s, and of course the Compromise of 1850, which was written by Henry Clay, Kentucky's most prominent son. But you see, they never really come to grips with the issues involved in the slavery controversy. Well, by 1860, it was pretty much on the minds of everybody. You see, there was a big presidential election that year. Now, the fellow that won the state of Kentucky, his name was John Bell, and he ran a party ticket known as the Constitutional Union Party. They believed in the Constitution and the Union of the States, but they really didn't address other issues involved in the election, slavery and land reform and tariffs and such. And although they did win Kentucky and Tennessee, they didn't win anybody else's states, you see. Well, now, the biggest party involved in that election was the Democrats. Now, they'd all gotten together down in Charleston, South Carolina in the summer of '60 to try to get together and decide who they was going to have as the presidential candidate. But like most politicians, though, they was more at each other's throats and they willing to agree on things. And, well, half of these Southern radicals bolted from the convention entirely. Well, they said they'd let the tempers cool off a couple months and meet again up in Baltimore, but the time they got there, they found the tempers hadn't cooled off at all. And once more, these Southern radicals bolted from the convention. Well, these Southern radicals then would be the ones that would support a man out of Kentucky for the office of president that year. And of course, his name was John C. Breckinridge out of Lexington. But the other wing of the Democratic Party, the northern wing, they would support a man out of Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas. But the fact that that big Democratic Party was split down the middle, you see, it opened the door wide open for the young Republican Party to win that election. And of course, their candidate was also out of the state of Illinois by the name of Abe Lincoln. Of course, now a lot of folks down south didn't think too much of this Lincoln and his Republican Party. You see, they was dedicated to limiting the spread of slavery in the newly occupied territories. He was talking about Arizona and this sort of areas. Of course, a lot of these southern planters down south, they made a lot of money out of slavery, and they didn't want it to be limited. They wanted it to spread, you see. Well, you basically got one group wanting to spread slavery and one group wanting to limit the spread of slavery, and something had to give. Well, what gave was the Union itself. You see, on the 20th of December of 1860, the folks in South Carolina got together down there in Charleston again. They passed what they called an Ordinance of Secession. Well, all they'd really done, you see, was to rescind the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which, of course, they ratified back in 1789. Well, it wasn't too far before folks from Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi and Florida and Louisiana and Texas, they too passed ordinances of secession. They decided to send the delegates to a place called Montgomery, Alabama. And it was there they all met and created what they call the Confederate States of America. Of course, they chose a Kentucky-born gentleman by the name of Jeff Davis as their president. Of course, this Lincoln fella up here in Washington, he didn't believe in this idea of secession. He said it was unconstitutional. Well, I'll tell you what you do. You go up there, Lincoln fella yourself, and you say, Mr. Lincoln, would you show me in the Constitution where it says anything at all about secession being illegal? Of course, he really threw a wrench into his works, you see, because ain't nothing in there about it at all. Of course, a lot of those folks up north believed him, I reckon. They wouldn't have sent so many folks into the field. Well, anyway, on about the 12th of April of 1861, our forces opened fire on a place called Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. You see, the Yankees wouldn't return it to the state of South Carolina. They said it was a federal fort. Well, of course, that started things happening real quick. Well, Mr. Lincoln had asked for 75,000 militia troops to help put down this here rebellion. And he sent telegrams to the governors of all the loyal states to inform them what their troop quotas would be. But you can imagine the look on that Lincoln fella's face when he opened up that telegram from the Kentucky governor, Mr. Barrag's office, told him that Kentucky had furnished no troops whatsoever for the wicked purpose of subduing the sister southern states. That might seem a bit rap to you folks. Well, folks over in Tennessee and Arkansas, they were so upset with Mr. Lincoln's call for troops that they too passed ordinances of secession, along with North Carolina and Virginia. Now the states that had seceded from the Union now numbered 11. Of course, Kentucky's situation in all this was a bit precarious. You see, all the states that had seceded from the Union was south of the Kentucky line, and all the states remaining loyal to it was north of the Kentucky line. Well, it was right hard for folks in Kentucky to make up their minds. You see, folks in the east, they was tied to the north because they knew they opened railroads and things. Folks over in western Kentucky, though, was tied south because they sold their produce and things down the river system to New Orleans. Indeed, it was right hard for folks in Kentucky to make up their minds, and oftentimes it split right down family lines. Well, Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden, I believe the picture right here, he had two sons. One of them was named Thomas, and he was a major general in the Confederate Army. Of course, his brother's name was George, and he was a major general in the Yankee Army. I come from Woodford County, Kentucky, and there was a family there called Buford, and there was 9 boys in the family. 4 of them followed with the Yankees, and 5 of them followed with the Confederacy. So it was hard for these folks to make up their minds, but well, the time was coming when they downright had to. You see, in September of 1861, Confederate forces under the command of this fellow named Leonidas Polk occupied a city called Columbus, Kentucky. Well, y'all might not know where Columbus is, but you see it in the map over here. It's right here on the banks of the Mississippi River. Not only is it on the banks of that river, but it's also real high bluffs up there, you see. And General Polk realized if we put some artillery on them bluffs, he could, of course, control all the traffic on that river. Plant them guns he did, over 140 of them, and it soon became known as the Gibraltar of the West. Boys swore them down. The Yankees had never taken it by storm, and they never did. Well, just the very next day, though, some Yankee troops under command of a fellow named Brigadier General U.S. Grant out of Illinois occupied Paducah, Kentucky. Now, although Kentucky had tried to maintain its neutrality through the summer of 61, of course, it had now been violated by both sides. And it wasn't too long before the recruit camps come into the state. Well, Confederate forces moved on in then, and they established what they call a defensive line in Kentucky. And it went from Cumberland Gap through a place called Mill Springs to Bowling Green, and then dropped on down to a couple forts on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers known as Henry and Donaldson, and then on back up to Columbus. You got to remember, you see, the Confederacy didn't want to fight no war. They just wanted to be left alone to go in peace. It was up there Yankee troops to fight what you might call an offensive war. Of course, now that shouldn't have been too hard for them. Ain't nothing as offensive as a Yankee in the first place. At any rate, the first thing they did to us was to hit us at a place called Mill Springs in January of 1862. And that was a cold, wet battlefield that day. As you might see from the picture over here, you see a lot of snow on the ground. Well, most of our boys was armed with these old flintlock muskets and smoothbore shotguns, much like what old Dale Boone might have had when he come across the mountain some 80 years ago. Of course, these Yankee troops, they had this new percussion-type firearm, like this here Trenton musket up top. They didn't have to worry about the powder getting wet, you see. And on top of that, our right flank was commanded by a fellow named Felix Zolikoff. Well, he was a real fine general and popular with his troops and all. The problem was couldn't see too good. Well, there was a regiment on the hill over yonder, and they was firing into his men, and boy, they was wearing gray coats. And they figured they was his own troops, and somehow there'd been a mix-up. So he jumped on his horse and rode over and told the colonel of the regiment to cease firing immediately. It turned out to be gray-clad Yankee troops, so instead of ceasing the fire, the colonel pulled his pistol out and put a bullet right through Zolikoff's heart, made him the first general to die in battle here in Kentucky. Well, about 10 days after that, some other Yankee troops under command of a fellow named James A. Garfield out of Ohio hit us on in eastern Kentucky at a place called Middle Creek. Well, again, our boys was armed with these old flintlocks and things, and they were pushed on back through Pound Gap into Virginia. Of course, now we'd ordered all kinds of these rifles like these percussion firearms called Enfield muskets from England, and we didn't have no problem shipping them through the Yankee blockade, but it took a while to get them by rail to the armies in the field, you see, from the Confederate ports. You see, our railroad transportation wasn't too good at the time. Now, of course, you give them Yankees an inch and they're going to take a mile, and now they control eastern Kentucky. They want to take over central and western Kentucky, too. And this time they decided to try something a little bit different. They come after us with what they call their 90-day wonders. Now, what I'm talking about here is the gunboats. You see, they had 7 of them, just like this one here called the K-Roll. And they was all named for cities on the river systems, like the St. Louis and the Louisville and Cincinnati and the Mound City. Well, they come down the river, you see, and hit us at Fort Henry. Now, Fort Henry, I believe, was badly situated to start off with, and I kind of feel the gentleman that laid that out must have been under some kind of intoxicant at the time. You see, the water in the river was rising, and the fort was built so low that while the battle was going on, the water was actually coming in over the sides of the fort. Well, the gunners were standing there fighting off them Yankee gunboats in deep, deep water. Well, now, the colonel in charge realized it was kind of foolish to try to maintain a fortification that was going to flood out anyway, so he asked for 15 volunteers. He and those 15 boys tried to hold off them Yankee gunboats, while the rest of the fellows went across this little stretch of land bridge here over to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Of course, it didn't take them too long to compel the surrender there at Fort Henry, and the Yankees turned the gunboats around on the Tennessee, went back up the Ohio, and come down to Cumberland, and they tried to do the same thing to us there at Fort Donelson. It turned out to be a much tougher nut for them to crack. The gunboats come down the river just like they had there at Henry, but this time our gunners knocked out them Yankee gunboats, even injured the gunboat commander. His name was Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote. Of course, now that the gunboats been knocked out, it brought in the need for Yankee land forces, and, well, again, they was commanded by that U.S. Grant fellow. Well, just a couple of weeks before that, he jumped across the Mississippi to a place called Belmont, Missouri, and tried to surprise some of our boys there, but the surprise was on General Grant. They whooped him pretty good. As a matter of fact, he was right lucky to get away with his life. One of the most amazing things I ever heard about, he had all of his troops on the boats, you see, and he was up riding around on the plane making sure all his troops was on the boats. Finally decided that there was, and came up to the land, and his horse folded up his rear legs and slid down the bank of the river onto the gangplank and walked off on the gangplank on the boat. One of the most amazing things I ever heard about. Well, anyway, the problem with this old General Grant was he didn't know how to stay whooped. Well, they surrounded us there at Fort Donelson, and although we tried to break out on the road to Nashville, and we did get about 2,000 troopers of the cavalry out, we was unsuccessful to get the main garrison out. The next day, Commander in Charge, Kentucky boy Simon Bolivar Button, was forced to surrender over 14,000 Confederate troops. Of course, now the war had been going on almost a year now. Well, this was the first big Yankee victory in the war, and as you might understand, they was all happy and joyful about it all. Well, they were so much happy about it, I read one of them Yankee newspapers out of Chicago said that they were so happy about the fall of Henry Donelson that anybody found on the streets of Chicago after 9 o'clock at night that was still sober would be arrested as secessions. But anyway, the forces I was with over at Bowling Green, as well as the Polk's boys in Columbus, we decided to withdraw through Kentucky and went down to a place called Corinth, Mississippi. Now you see, Corinth has got a north-south as well as an east-west rail line there. And we figured we could bring in troops from all over the Confederacy and push these daggone Yankees back where they come from. Of course, the Yankees come down the Tennessee River, and they come down with boat transports, and the park is settled down here just about the Tennessee line, a place they call Pittsburgh Landing. Well, now about 4 miles from that landing was a little old log meeting house. It had an Indian name. They called it Shiloh, a place of peace. But I was afraid there wasn't going to be much peace there. You see, that Yankee General Grant was sitting there with 35,000 Yankee troops. And he was just awaiting on another Yankee general by the name of Buell, who was marching with 35,000 more Yankee troops from Nashville. And they figured once they got them all together, they'd come hit our boys at Corinth. Well, now the commander of the Southern Army, Kentucky born Albert Sidney Johnston, he realized it wasn't no problem to whip one Yankee army, but it might be kind of hard to whip 2 of them at once. So what he decided to do then was to hit General Grant before Buell arrived there. And on the 6th day of April, 1862, along about 4:30 in the morning, the Confederate Army marched down and crashed on into them Yankee camps. We had 3 battle lines. Each one of them was 4 miles long from end to end. Now, General Grant swears up and down he wasn't surprised there at Shiloh, but if that's true, how come so many of his boys was bayoneted and shot in the tents while they slept? And how come so many of our boys had the first hot meal they'd had in days because when the Yankees run from the camps, they left hot food for us on the fire? But we pushed them back on the right flank. We pushed them back on the left flank. But the center was holding kind of strong, a place they called the Sunken Road. Well, they soon called it different names. Started calling it the Hornet's Nest because bullets was buzzing around the head so fast and furious, it sounded like bees was buzzing. Well, one old boy in my brigade was talking to me after the battle. He said that he was sitting there firing in the Hornet's Nest and thought the whole Yankee army was firing back at him. His mother wrote back and said, "Son, why don't you find yourself a tree or something to hide behind?" He wrote back and told us, says, "Mama, there just wasn't enough trees there for the officers to hide behind, let alone the men." But anyway, General Johnson told us to make one last charge that afternoon, and we charged that Hornet's Nest one more time, and we surrounded it and captured over 2,200 of them Yankees under General Prentice. We paid a right deal price for it, you see, because General Johnson, our commander, took a bullet in his leg and it cut the poor man's artery, and the poor fellow bled to death. Well, he had a tourniquet in his pocket. He would just put it on and would have saved his life. Anyway, the commander fell on the shoulders then of a fellow named Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Now, he's the same fellow that done fired on Fort Sumter back in '61, and he figured the Yankees been pretty well whooped that day. Postal rest all arms that night and finished them off first thing in the morning. Well, unknown to us that night, that Yankee General Buell arrived on the field and reinforced the Yankee army by 35,000 more troops. We woke up the next morning facing twice as many Yankees as we'd done the day before. We didn't have no reinforcements at all. Well, old Beauregard figured that discretion being a better part of valor, he gave us orders to withdraw back toward Kearney. And the Yankee was in charge of all this, was up in St. Louis at the time. That fellow by the name of Major General Henry Hallett. They called him Old Brains. Well, he was real upset with Grant for being surprised now at Shiloh, so he come down to Shiloh to take command of the assault on Corinth. Now, it's only 20 miles from where that battle was to Corinth, Mississippi, but it took the Yankees 6 weeks to get there. You see, we had them so daggone scared about being attacked, and what they'd do is they'd advance their men out about a half a mile and pull out the picks and shovels and dig trenches. Then they'd go another half a mile and dig some more trenches. Well, no wonder they tried to tunnel all the way to Corinth. It took them 6 weeks. While them Yankees was doing all their pick and shovel work, we swung around the flank and started out on what we called the Great Invasion. And this was part of a two-pronged Confederate advance of the North. You see, Bobby Lee and his boys over in Virginia, of course, had advanced north into Maryland, and they'd come across the Yankees at a place called Sharpsburg, Battle of Antietam. But over here in Kentucky, you see, we had not one but two armies invading north. Kirby Smith and his boys come up through Cumberland Gap, and they're running the Yankees at a place called Richmond, Kentucky. Now, our boys thought it was the third battle of Bull Run. You see, the reason was because they was commanded by a fellow named William Nelson. Stood 6'4", weighed 300 pounds. Nicknamed him Bull. Well, they was whooped so bad, old Bull jumped on his horse and he run all the way back to Cincinnati that night. Anyway, the main army come up through central Tennessee, and we run into the Yankees at a place called Munfordville. And that's where the L&M rail line, you see, crosses the Green River. Of course, the Yankees was using the railroad to supply armies and things to Tennessee, and we kind of burned it to the ground to relieve them of that opportunity. And we had a whole army on the north bank of the Green River, and the Yankee army was on the south bank of the Green River, but their base of supplies was behind us in Louisville. We had them right in the palms of our hand on the water. That foolish General Bragg ours gave us orders to withdraw toward Bardstown. Well, I reckon what he had in mind was, you see, he wanted to inaugurate this fellow named Richard Hawes as Kentucky's second provisional governor. Our first governor, George Johnson, had fallen on the field at Shiloh and had been killed, you see. Well, Richard Hawes was standing there in Frankfort, had his arm up being sworn in as Confederate governor, and daggone if the Yankees didn't start shelling the city of Frankfort. Kind of cut the festivities a bit short, as you might understand. Well, old Bragg figured, says, well, if the Yankee army's right outside of Frankfort, I'm going to call all my men together and we'll whoop them right here. So we sent out orders to all of his wing commanders throughout Kentucky to brush away what Yankee resistance was in their front and come to his assistance at Versailles, where they would meet and fight the Battle of Kentucky. Well, it sounded real good on paper. The only problem was, you see, is old General Bragg had been deluded as to the whereabouts of the Yankee army. You see, there was only one division of them outside of Frankfort. The rest of the Yankee army was a little bit southwest of there, a little city called Perryville. Well, we had a commander in Perryville too, General Polk, same fellow that fight Columbus. And he opened up General Bragg's orders, told him to brush away what Yankee resistance was in his front and come to assistance at Versailles. So on the 8th day of October, he opened them battle lines. And then commenced the biggest and bloodiest battle ever fought on the soil of sacred Kentucky. We pushed the Yankees back about a mile and a half that night. But then we realized our cavalry come in and said, folks, there's 35,000 Yankees on the field. We only had 8,000. So under the cover of darkness, they gave us orders to withdraw once more. So we come down to a place called Murfreesboro. We camped on the banks of Stones River. Of course, once again, don't you know, the Yankees done followed us down there too. Well, the last day of 1862 and the first 2 days of 63, we fought another big battle, a battle there at Stones River. Now, the Kentucky Brigade to which I was attached, we were part of what was called the Reserve Corps. And what that means is that the first 3 corps would find out where the Yankees was, and where they was the thickest, they'd send in the reserves. Well, in this case, it was off on the right flank. You see, there was a big hill off to the side, and the Yankees was sitting on top of it, and the field blasters out, watching the movements and such. And General Bragg had given Breckinridge orders to knock these Yankees off this hill. Well, they called out the Kentucky Brigade to do so, all 8,000 of us. And we marched down the prettiest battle lines you ever did see, and the infantry got their orders to fix bayonets and charge, and they charged, and the Yankees started jumping off this hill like fleas off a dog's back and running like scared rabbits. We had a great old time running and gunning and shooting Yankees in the back for about 2 miles. And then all of a sudden they jumped behind some prepared breastworks and moved the brush out of the way. We realized we'd done run into a trap because we was looking down the muzzles of 60 Yankee cannons. And they opened up on us with the solid shot and the exploding shot and the canister and the grape shot. In less than 20 minutes, we lost over 1,500 soldiers. Every one of them was true Kentucky born. Well, there's one old infantry soldier that was in that charge, had a rifle in his arm, and he was charging toward them Yankee lines. And along come one of them Yankee solid shots and took off the poor fella's leg. Of course, he wasn't no good for the charge no more. He was laying there in the grass and watched the rest of the brigade go up, beat them Yankee cannons, and they were soon repulsed, and they started drifting back across the land they just covered. And this one fellow was laying there in the grass saying, "Please help me, somebody help me. The Yankees done shot my leg off, and they're going to let me lay here and bleed to death." Finally, one old soldier heard it, you see, and he picked him up, threw him across the shoulder, and started going back to the rebel lines with him. And, well, along come another Yankee solid shot and took off the poor wounded man's head. But the boy that was carrying him didn't realize what happened, you see. He carried him on back to the lines and finally got to the cover of the river there, and one old soldier come up to him and says, "What are you doing carrying that dead man? He's had his head shot off." He picked him up off his shoulder and looked at him and said, "Well, that lying scoundrel, he told me it was his leg." But anyway, after the Battle of Stones River, you see, we went into winter quarters at a place called Tullahoma, Tennessee. And I guess the only battle of significance that occurred there was about the 3rd day of April. You see, there wasn't no Yankees in the way there was. And we went to bed that night and everything was normal. Woke up the next morning, had 6 inches of snow on the ground. Well, like I said, there wasn't no Yankees around, and boys being boys, most of the Kentucky troops started throwing some snowballs at some Tennessee troops. Well, it wasn't too long before the whole brigades were involved. Even the brigade dog from the 4th Kentucky went out and met his match against some Tennessee dog. He received an honorable wound, too, I'll admit. But it wasn't too long before the officers come out on the horses and they started directing the movements of this big old snowball fight. Of course, most folks don't care too much for officers, you see, and them officers took a lot of casualties themselves. But they finally had to call off along about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on account of the high casualty rate. There was a bunch of broken ribs and a few broken noses and things. Seems like a few of the boys would pack a rock or something inside that snowball, you see. But anyway, went on down in, the Yankees tried to outflank us there. We moved on down into Chattanooga, and of course we tried to hold the Yankees from there and put that Yankee General Sherman in charge down there. And soon took Chattanooga, moved on down to Atlanta, and we spent 6 weeks of fighting day by day trying to hold the Yankees out of Atlanta. Then old Sherman said he was going to put his men out on what he called his march to the sea. He said he was going to make Georgia howl. Well, now figure out how he done it. He took his 20,000 troops and lined them up about arm's length from each other, and then he gave them all a match. And they proceeded to burn the state of Georgia. They burned a pathway 60 miles wide through that area. Well, even if a crow tried to go through there, he had to carry his own rations with him. But up here in Kentucky, you see, they had a different kind of warfare going on after '63. They call it guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrillas have been one folk or another, one army or the other, that had decided to desert for whatever reasons and make war on innocent civilians. Are we talking about people like William Clark Quantrell out of Missouri and some of the boys that rode with him, like Frank and Jesse James and Cole and Bobby Younger? Then there was another boy by the name of Jerome Clark. Maybe y'all haven't heard of him by that name. Perhaps the name Sue Mundy rings a bell to you. You see, Mr. Clark had real feminine features, and oftentimes it was his likeness then to dress up in the clothing of a lady and infiltrate the Yankee lines. Well, he'd right up to them Yankee officers, talk to them, find out where the troops and such was, and then, of course, he'd get his men then and go out and circle around and hit them where they was weakest. Well, it took them about 2 years to figure it out. I reckon that's pretty fast for Yankee folks, but anyway, they finally caught up with him near Brandenburg, Kentucky, and they took him to Louisville and they put him on trial. Well, that afternoon he received what you might call Yankee justice. You see, he could be seen swinging from a tree in downtown Louisville. Well, folks, I don't want to bore y'all too much with my talk. I have a little show for you I'd like to show you on the war in Kentucky. They can be